Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive.
Absolutely. Always ready to dig into some fascinating history.
Well, today's subject is definitely fascinating and pretty disturbing, to be honest.
I have to agree with you there. This one's going to stay with you for a while.
Yeah, we're looking into the life and crimes of Jane Toppan.
One of America's most prolific female serial killers, yeah. A nurse who poisoned her victims.
And, we've got a whole stack of sources here. Court transcripts,
Mm-hmm.
historical accounts,
Some pretty chilling stuff.
even Jane Toppan's own confessions.
Which are, well, they're quite something. It's like she was almost proud of what she did.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that makes this case so fascinating and so disturbing.
It really makes you question, what could drive someone to commit such horrific acts.
Right, and how does she get away with it for so long? We're talking about dozens of victims.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to try to figure out in this deep dive. How did she manage to operate undetected for so long?
Yeah, think about it. Dozens of people dying under suspicious circumstances.
Yeah.
And yet she was a respected nurse. Nobody really suspected her.
Well, the late 1800s, right? Different medical practices,
Yeah.
different societal norms. But even considering all that, Jane Toppan's personality, the way she was able to manipulate people,
Mm-hmm.
that played a huge role. She was charming, deceitful. She knew how to exploit the trust people placed in her as a caregiver.
And that ability to gain trust is a big part of this story.
Oh, absolutely. It's central to understanding how she was able to operate the way she did.
It all started, with Honora Kelly. Abandoned as a little girl,
Mhm.
left at a Boston asylum.
A pretty grim start to life.
Yeah, adopted and reclaimed Jane Toppan. And at first she seemed to be doing okay. She was even, charismatic,
Mm-hmm.
intelligent, showed promise.
But underneath that pleasant exterior.
Oh, yeah. There were definitely cracks. She had this habit of telling these outrageous lies.
Yeah, and always shifting blame.
Always someone else's fault. And, this disturbing fascination with pain and suffering.
It's all there in the historical accounts, even from a young age.
Looking back, it's like these were all red flags.
Huge red flag.
But at the time, nobody really put it all together.
I guess it's always easier to see the signs in hindsight, right?
And then she goes into nursing, and it's like a dark spark ignited.
Yeah, it's like her training gave her the tools, the knowledge to act on her dark impulses.
She excelled in her studies, impressed all her instructors.
But her classmates, though, they saw a different side of her.
Oh, yeah. What did they see?
Well, they described her as a gossip, a thief,
Oh.
someone who really took pleasure in the misfortune of others. Chilling, isn't it?
It's pretty unsettling to think that even back then, people who knew her saw these disturbing tendencies.
Makes you wonder, was this darkness always there? Or did her traumatic childhood, the abandonment, maybe even abuse, did that plant the seeds for what she became?
That's a really good question.
Modern research suggests that early exposure to violence, abuse, that can be a major factor in the development of psychopathic traits.
So maybe it was a combination of nature and nurture.
Could be. It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something to think about.
So let's move on to Jane Toppan, the nurse. Jolly Jane, as some called her.
Ah, yes, Jolly Jane. Some patients loved her, but others.
Yeah, not so much. Didn't she say something about keeping old people alive? She had opinions about that.
She did, and strong ones.
Yeah.
And those opinions, well, she acted on them, with a pretty chilling sense of conviction, I might add.
How so?
Well, her own confessions detail her early experiments with morphine and atropine.
Oh, wow.
She'd test different dosages on patients, not to help them, mind you, but to observe their reactions.
Wow. Just to see what would happen.
Exactly. And she even wrote about experiencing delirious enjoyment, voluptuous delight from it. It's really unsettling.
So she was deriving pleasure from the suffering of her patients.
It seems that way, and that's where the story takes an even darker turn.
How so?
Because it wasn't just about playing God, about controlling life and death. Jane Toppan confessed to experiencing a sexual thrill from murder.
Really?
Yeah. In her confessions, she described injecting her victims, then getting into bed with them as they died, whispering to them, caressing their skin. It's hard to even grasp the level of depravity.
Wow. So this wasn't just about, mercy killing or something.
No, not at all. This points to something much more disturbing, something called sexual sadism. It's a dangerous psychological condition where individuals derive sexual gratification from inflicting pain and suffering, humiliation on others.
So in Jane's case, her actions weren't about easing suffering, but about fulfilling some deeply disturbed desires.
Precisely. And all the while, she was able to conceal her true nature, fool everyone around her.
Two prestigious hospitals, too. Cambridge Hospital,
Mm.
Massachusetts General.
Even they overlooked complaints, suspicions, because she was so good with the patients, or at least the ones who survived. It's pretty chilling when you think about it. Even institutions we see as, beacons of knowledge and care, even they can be infiltrated by darkness.
You said earlier that Jane was really good at manipulating people, getting them to do what she wanted.
Yeah.
Remember that $50 she got when she turned 18?
Oh, yeah. The money she inherited. That was a turning point in the story, wasn't it?
Instead of using it to start her own life, she stayed with the Toppans, worked as a maid for her foster sister Elizabeth and her husband.
And she was deeply resentful of Elizabeth, wasn't she?
Oh yeah, totally consumed by resentment and jealousy. I mean, Elizabeth was everything Jane wasn't.
Sure.
Happily married.
Successful.
Everything Jane wanted but couldn't have.
It must have been torture for her living in that house, constantly reminded of what she lacked.
And 2 years after Elizabeth died, Jane confesses to poisoning her.
With morphine and atropine, just like her other victims. And she didn't hold back either. In her confession, she describes letting her die slowly, with gripping torture.
So this wasn't a mercy killing. This was cold-blooded murder.
Driven by jealousy, resentment, and it establishes a chilling pattern.
Because it wasn't just Elizabeth, right?
Oh no. Patients, landlords, even a close friend. Nobody seemed safe from Jane's deadly impulses.
You're telling me, like with Florence Calkins, the housekeeper. Elizabeth's husband's housekeeper.
Yes. After Elizabeth died, Jane thought she finally had a chance with Oral.
Oh, the husband.
Yeah. But then Florence came along, and Jane saw her as a rival.
A romantic rival.
Exactly. And without hesitation, she poisoned her. Just like that.
So she was eliminating anyone she saw as an obstacle.
That's right. It's like she was playing this twisted game, and everyone around her was a pawn.
And poison was her weapon of choice. A little bit here, a little bit there, all with a smile and a reassuring word.
It's chilling, isn't it? The premeditation, the deception, she got a thrill out of it, the whole act, the whole performance.
But eventually, right, this had to catch up with her.
Oh, absolutely. All these deaths. It was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions.
And that brings us to 1901, a series of deaths that would finally unravel Jane Toppan's web of deceit.
It all started with a simple request. Pay the rent.
Pay the rent.
Yeah. Mary Davis, an elderly woman, just asked Jane to pay her overdue rent. And that turned out to be a fatal mistake.
What happened?
Instead of paying, Jane poisoned her.
Wow.
Mary suffered for weeks before finally dying, but it didn't stop there. Mary's death was just the beginning. A 6-week killing spree that targeted the whole Davis family.
Wow, she really went on a rampage.
It's like she was getting bolder, more reckless. She even tried to burn down their house several times.
After moving in with them.
Oh, yeah. Pretending to care for the grieving widower. It's like she was pushing the boundaries, seeing how far she could go before getting caught.
But, small town assumptions. People not really understanding poisons back then.
Mm-hmm.
And Jane's ability to manipulate people, it all helped her avoid suspicion.
For a while. It's a reminder that evil can be hiding in plain sight, even in the people we trust the most.
A scary thought, for sure.
It challenges everything we think we know about who to trust, who to be wary of, and it forces us to confront the dark side of human nature.
Yeah, and that's what makes cases like Jane Toppan's so fascinating, but also so terrifying. But we'll delve more into that later.
It's true. For a time, Jane's facade held up, but even the most elaborate deceptions, they eventually crumble.
Right.
And in Jane's case, well, there were people who noticed things, the inconsistencies, the patterns.
Yeah, the unsettling pattern.
Exactly, and they dared to question what was happening.
It makes you wonder how many people might have suspected something, but were just too afraid to speak up.
Oh, absolutely, especially back then. I mean, accusing a respected nurse, a woman in a position of authority, that must have been incredibly difficult.
And, back then, forensic science was in its infancy.
Right.
So understanding the effects of these poisons, morphine, atropine.
It wasn't as straightforward as it is today.
Yeah.
It was easier for someone like Jane to operate under the radar, attribute the deaths to, natural causes, or some vague illness.
Chilling to think about how all these factors just came together.
It really was a perfect storm.
But thankfully, some individuals spoke up. They refused to be silent.
They did, and thank goodness for that. They saw through the facade,
Hmm.
and they brought her reign of terror to an end.
People like Captain Paul Gibbs and Ira Cushing.
Exactly. They refused to dismiss their suspicions, even when others tried to downplay them.
They just had a gut feeling that something was wrong.
They did, and they were determined to uncover the truth.
What convinced them that this wasn't just a series of unfortunate coincidences? What was the turning point?
Well, a number of things, but the key factor was the exhumation of two of the Davis family members, Genevieve and Minnie. Autopsies showed lethal doses of poison.
So no longer speculation, concrete evidence of foul play.
Exactly. The science was undeniable.
That must have sent shockwaves through the community.
Absolutely. It was a huge scandal.
What was Jane's reaction when she was arrested?
Well, you might expect panic, denial,
Right.
maybe even trying to shift the blame.
Yeah.
But Jane, no. She remained calm, collected.
Really?
Yeah, she even agreed to return to Barnstable for questioning.
It's almost like she thought she could talk her way out of it.
I think she believed her own lies. She'd gotten away with it for so long.
But this time the evidence was overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
Did that facade finally crumble?
You know, it did, but not in the way you might think. Instead of showing remorse, she started boasting about her crimes.
Really?
She confessed to 31 murders,
Wow.
described her methods, her motivations, and she did it all with this chilling detachment.
31 murders. It's hard to even grasp that.
It's a staggering number, and it raises a big question. What could possibly justify such horrific acts?
Did she offer any explanation?
She did. She claimed they were acts of mercy, that her victims were better off dead. Kind of an angel of death thing.
An angel of death.
Yeah, that's how she saw herself, easing their suffering.
But, I mean, come on. The way she did it, the deliberate cruelty.
It doesn't add up.
Yeah.
It's a classic case of a killer trying to rationalize their actions, create a narrative to justify the depravity.
Did the psychological evaluations during the trial offer any insights?
They did, actually. They're quite fascinating. The alienists who examined her said she was intelligent, coherent.
Okay.
But they also concluded she suffered from homicidal mania.
Homicidal mania.
Yeah, a condition they considered incurable at the time.
What do they mean by homicidal mania?
Well, they described Jane as having a complete absence of moral sense
What?
and an inability to distinguish right from wrong. They pointed to her constant lying, her manipulation of others, even when there was no benefit to her. It was all just a game.
So you mentioned earlier she boasted about her crimes.
Hmm?
Did she ever express any remorse during the trial? Any regret for what she'd done?
No, none at all. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the attention, the notoriety.
Wow. No empathy whatsoever.
The Boston Globe, they covered the trial, and they described her as having an air of self-satisfaction.
It's hard to believe.
I know, and that just shows how deeply disturbed she was, that she couldn't even grasp the magnitude of her actions, the devastation she caused.
With her confession and all the evidence against her, it seemed like a guilty verdict was a sure thing.
You'd think so, right.
But the jury found her not guilty.
Not guilty by reason of insanity.
That's a verdict that always sparks debate.
It does.
In Jane's case, what did that mean for her future?
Well, even though the verdict was not guilty, she wasn't set free. No. The court realized how dangerous she was. So they sentenced her to life confinement at the Taunton Insane Hospital. It was a recognition that even if she wasn't criminally responsible because of her mental state, she was still a threat.
Yeah, makes sense.
So Jane Toppan, the Jolly Jane, went from respected nurse to a patient in an asylum, locked away for good.
It makes you wonder what her life was like after that.
It does.
Confined to an institution,
Yeah.
no more control, no more manipulation.
A very different life from the one she'd been living.
It's hard to imagine, what it must have been like for her in Taunton.
Yeah.
Confined, no more control.
She thrived on manipulation, on having power over others. And then suddenly, it's all gone.
Right, and she's the one being controlled.
It's really a fascinating psychological question. How did she adapt to that? A woman who spent her whole life deceiving and controlling everyone around her.
Well, the records from Taunton paint a pretty grim picture.
Yeah, they do. Jolly Jane, the charmer, the manipulator, she seems to disappear.
Wow, that's a huge contrast from the Jane Toppan we've been talking about.
It is.
What happened? Did she finally realize the consequences of her actions? Or was it just, the confinement itself that caused some kind of mental breakdown?
It's tough to say for sure.
Yeah.
But the reports suggest it was a combination of things. One article in the Boston Globe, they described her as emaciated, said her high spirits were gone, replaced by fretfulness and peevishness.
And she was afraid of being poisoned herself.
Yeah, think about that. The woman who used poison to kill, now terrified of being poisoned.
That's,
Poetic justice.
yeah, I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
Did she ever, express any remorse for the families she destroyed, the lives she took?
There's no record of that. Even at the end, it seems like she couldn't really face what she'd done. It's like the same mental barriers that allowed her to commit those crimes also prevented her from feeling any real guilt or empathy.
The human mind is a strange and sometimes scary thing.
It really is.
Jane Toppan's story, it challenges everything we think we know about good and evil, about sanity and madness.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that it can be charming, disarming.
Yeah. You never really know who to trust.
It's a cautionary tale, but it's also a story of those who fought for justice, who refused to let her get away with it. People like Captain Gibbs, Ira Cushing.
Their persistence is really inspiring. They help bring an end to her reign of terror. Jane Toppan's story might be over, but it's a story that stays with you.
It does. And the lessons we can learn from it are timeless. About vigilance, about trusting your instincts, and never ignoring those red flags.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the complexities of this case.
The dark side of human nature.
And the fine line between good and evil.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed.
And be careful out there.